Know this. Introducing the original Blood Clot podcast, not players. Soothing semantic. Special dedication all the way from New York. Boom. Yeah man, SWOT semantic. Hear me now. Boom. Soothing semantic. Hear me now. Big ups to the man now. Soothing semantic.
On another episode of Soothing Semantics, I am your host, Rafi Pinsky. Today on the show, we have Elena. Welcome, Elena. How are you?
I'm very well. How are you?
Not bad at all. It's a wonderful day in the Sunshine State. So, without further ado, we want to go into a bit of Elena's earlier years and how she went from practicing law to neuroscience, to going into neuroscience. So tell us how you were once an attorney and are now a brain person.
So that's a very common question that I'm being asked. Thank you for asking. So I come from a very small town in Russia, from the far east of Russia, where in the beginning, where I was in my teenagers, I was very interested in the matters of state and human relationships, actually, the history of human civilizations and how people came together to organize states and law, to have rules amongst themselves in order to progress and evolve. And this was my big passion. I went to law school when I was 16. I think I didn't have such a great experience with learning science. It was not invigorating enough for me in my early ages.
How did you go? See, this happens in other countries. It's more of a common thing where I hear of somebody graduating from college at like 14. You started law school at 16 because all Americans for the most part are still in school, in high school at 16. They don't go. Then they have to do 4 years of undergrad and then law school. So they're not in law school till their mid-20s usually. So how does that work?
It's just a different educational system, and usually in Russia we graduate from high school around age 17 and go straight for a specialized school, whether it's medical school or law school or engineering, whatever it is that is specialized.
You don't have to do the whole bachelor's degree thing? You just skip it?
No. Yeah, you just specialize immediately.
Looks like I'm moving to Russia.
Sciences or
No, because it's a lot of student debt.
It's a little late now.
I mean, I'm not going for law, but maybe my kids. No, honestly, I wouldn't move to Russia, but that's I guess that's one perk.
Indeed, yes, it is. Although I was so young, so age 21, I was already a lawyer, and I went to work as a lawyer. Although what truly moved me from being a lawyer to becoming a scientist was the personal event, which was the passing away of my mother, which was very rapid and unexpected when I was 17. So it was right first year after my law school, and it was so unexpected. Like, she passed away in 3 days, and it had a huge impact on me in the ways that I had to really reevaluate the reality and very much to understand, or was called to understand, in life and death. And in that quest, I've read many philosophy books, esoteric books, and been drawn to popularized science and some movies on quantum physics and involvement of consciousness, integration of reality. That ignited my interest in truly understanding life, and I've learned about sort of like the biochemistry of emotions from popularized documentaries such as What the Bleep Do We Know? And I can't remember the other ones, but I've read some books that also really gave me a different perspective, and I was really drawn to understanding it deeper rather than being lost in esoteric teachings, and to truly have a basis of scientific method in my understanding of reality, where I could merge the two, merge the spiritual experience and experiential evidence of perceiving this world through personal experiences and the understanding of the science. So I've had this goal, and I decided to pursue another degree. So I had to start in a way from scratch. I had to start from all the basic sciences and calculus and chemistry and physics. And I wanted to move and study in the United States. So at age 23, I managed to, through a series of synchronistic events, I managed to arrive to Alaska, and this is where I studied my degree.
Mm-hmm.
In Alaska, I also, so I got a degree in biochemistry.
You liked Alaska?
I loved Alaska a lot, yes. Although for somebody who is in early 20s, it's quite an isolating place to be. Like it's a very nice family place, I think, or it's a nice place for solitude. Yeah.
Yeah, if you're the kind of person that really doesn't care to... I mean, don't get me wrong, I've never been there, but I feel like every non-Alaskan's perception of Alaska, which I think is probably accurate, is this freezing cold place. There's a lot of fishing. There's a lot of beautiful scenery, but that's what it is. You think of solitude and a lot of quiet.
This is an very interesting point. Anytime you ask anybody about, what is it like, right? What we're really asking, I'm going in a little bit into neuroscience. What we're really asking is, what is your perception and personal experience of it like? Because it might be on average on the bell curve, there could be some similar reports of experiences, but then it truly comes down to your personal reality. So in my reality, it was such that I actually loved the place. I love mountains. I love connecting with the nature. But it was also the experience of constantly working and studying and working so hard and being an immigrant. I mean, I'm not even going to go into detail. Plus, dealing with cold and a lot of other things that becoming prison layer after layer in my experience that made it a little more miserable than it could have been. Like, it could have been a much more beautiful experience, and it was. It still is in the perception.
Well, what was miserable about it?
The cold.
Well, aren't you used to that?
A lot of work, honestly? The darkness. Well, yes, it doesn't mean that I like it.
I mean, it felt like Russians are just kind of used to it. It's like that,
the misery of the
it's
whole
like
nation.
that tough connection, kind of in New York, where it's freezing during the winter and it builds this tough exterior.
Yes.
This Russian, the bitter cold.
Very much. That's another different...
Something we respect about Russians. Mother Russia. You just always have these big, brawly Russian men, and they're carrying trees. And
women who stop horses while running.
Yeah, or women who wrestle horses. And this is why when they come to a hot place, they're like, everybody's so weak. Because it's just the coldness makes you, in a way, coldness does make you strong. Because it's not as pleasant. You have to grin and bear it and survive it.
Well, it's not just that. Definitely that. And also you could see, in warmer climates, there's microenvironments. And if you look at it, just even the perception of evolution, how species adapt to environments.
Oh, I love that. I love. Oh, is this a natural selection kind of conversation?
Kind of natural selection conversation.
Yes. Even as humans, we have to adapt to the environment, and the strong survive. The weak kind of die out. And
actually, this is not true. Strong do not survive. The fittest survive. If the weak one is the one that fits the environment, it will survive. So basically, with the adaptation that is fitting the environment would progress. Because if it's the big strong that needs, let's say, a lot of food, then the bigger and stronger may die off. And actually, I think that's what happened to some of the prehistoric humans, that they died off because they were too large, because it was harder to hunt for food. So the fittest, or the one that suits the environment, will survive.
That makes so much sense.
But the microenvironments, you could see, there's so much in culture that I look through the prism of that idea of, again, a personal reality, but more of a collective personal reality, where there's a there's certain amount of history and brainwashing, and there's a certain amount of the actual physical environment that people are connected by. So the adaptations that they have to deal with, the adaptations that they have to go through in order to incorporate into daily living, and also the whole component of, there is an epigenetic component as well, which I don't know if you're familiar with epigenetics, but epigenetics is the adaptations of the way in which the DNA is being used or expressed based on interaction with environment. So we could be, let's take in the zygotic twins. They could be completely similar genetic composition, right? Completely identical genetic composition. But if they were growing up in different environments, that their adaptations and so epigenetically they would be different. I think there was even studies such as sending twins, like sending the twin into space, comparing to the twin that was left on Earth, and how much of the gene expression was changed. But this is, of course, this is going into space. That's
so much deeper than nature and nurture. So you're saying
it is nature and nurture.
Okay. But you bring genetics into it, so it sounds deeper than just.
Okay.
Okay. I mean, that's what it sounds like coming from someone that doesn't know genetics. I mean. So that's automatically what I assume. But then in space, meaning are you telling me that if they're identical, then their genetic makeup must be very similar?
Yes.
So when you say the word is epigenetic?
Epi. So epi means above.
Epigenetic. EPI. Okay. Epigenetic. The gene makeup is actually changing?
The genes are the same, but everything in genetics, like we are genetically very similar to banana and
I feel like a banana sometimes, Elena.
Like a vegetable.
Yeah, I feel it. Sometimes when I wake up in the morning, I just kind of. No, bananas have energy. I have energy, and we both feel yellow sometimes.
Right. Well, we are all forms of life, and
really trying to make corny jokes here.
I see. Yes. Yeah. So, in any case, coming back to genetics, so we're very similar genetically to bananas. Well, about 50% to a worm, to like a deep sea worm.
By the way, this fly is really fucking with me.
To a fly, you're also very genetically comparable to
Drosophila.
But Drosophila fly, yes. But the difference is largely, and when I say genetically, I'm talking about the coding part of the genome, the part that actually makes the proteins. The part is actually what we call expressed. So DNA by itself is just a code, but what does all the work in the body and serves all of the functions is the proteins. But what is different between us is the way that this code is used.
Okay.
It's almost like, the ability to read between the lines, but it's not exactly between the lines, but the ability to truly comprehend and to make something out of that code that is a much different level of complexity. And this is also achieved by the dark matter of the DNA, which is the non-coding regions of the DNA, which are those regions that are still being studied. There's still a lot of unknown in it, and those are the regions that take and use up the information of the DNA and create this other organism, like human versus a banana. I mean, of course, there's a lot of genetic gap still in evolution.
I think we're completely the same, to be honest with you. I don't really see a difference.
When did you diverge from the conversation? How do we start talking about it?
About what, bananas?
About bananas.
Well, you said that bananas are genetically are extremely similar to us. And then I decided to make jokes about bananas.
Right, but let's come back to the point we were trying to make.
Black matter? You're talking
Before the black matter.
Black Lives Matter?
Black Lives Matter. Exactly.
No, but you were talking about parts of the genetic code that can't be kind of not counted but checked. You're saying there are black areas of the
yes
code,
but they're actually using what is really happening, that the black matter of the DNA is what helps us to use the code, to utilize the code differently, and that's what makes us ultimately humans versus like monkeys versus other primates or mammals. But so this is very interesting. But to even go back to the conversation of how I was in Alaska, so that's how it started. And why am I talking about genetics? Because I ultimately went for a PhD in neurogenetics, in neuroscience, but with a very heavy genetic component. So my specialty is in neurogenetics and in gene editing using CRISPR technology. Are you familiar with the CRISPR?
Well, not exactly. We spoke about it a bit.
So, in any case, CRISPR is very cool technology that is now being used in science in order to edit genes. And editing of the genes is the future really of humans fighting the genetic diseases.
Everyday life, routine, waking up in the morning. How do you find that neuroscience has kind of given you a deeper understanding of your personal daily life? Waking up in the morning, having a schedule, making sure you get the right amount of sleep. On a deeper scientific level, how do those things play out in your life?
It is definitely, even remembering myself from the time before I became a scientist is obviously a completely different person. So that layer of all of these gadgets of knowledge that changed my perception of the world through the understanding of science has been a drastic change, dramatic to who I am and how I see the world, of course. Not only I use not just neuroscience, just use science and biology in general from many different perspectives in my daily life, and I love to call it biohacking, which is a term that is used now. It's a very trendy term for using the knowledge of biology and knowledge of science in order to optimize your human performance. But I also love the words such as mind hacking and soul hacking, which is using different experience in order to enter different states and to change your perceptual personal experience of the reality. So that goes into realm of some of the practices that I do, like you've mentioned sleep. I'm very religious about my sleep. People really under-evaluate and underestimate how much importance sleep has for brain function. Like for in studies of, I'm not even going to get into it because it's a whole different subject.
This leads me to an interesting question, actually. There are a lot of people, and this happens to all of us at any given moment, when we're in college studying for exams, we'll end up sleeping till 2, waking up at 6, and not getting the proper amount of sleep because we're studying. And I've come to realize, and correct me if you think I'm wrong, it's so much better to push off that studying for the next day, but make sure you get those 8 hours in and keep that constant schedule. Meaning, you have a 2-week window to study for a final. Don't cram it. This is obvious. Don't cram it all in the last 2 days. You end up getting no sleep. You're much less likely to do well. And everyone's like, no shit, Rafi, congratulations. But if you really stick to this plan, and this is not something I stuck to in school. I was not good about this. But if you stick to, say, a 2-week window, you give yourself exactly 2 weeks, and you make sure that at 10 p.m., no matter how much you need to study, you're done for the night, you get those 8 hours, and then you do it again. And this way, even though you didn't feel like you really busted your ass, you didn't spend, you didn't stay up till 2 a.m., there's this regimented schedule where you're getting the proper sleep, so my question essentially is that a much better, more effective thing to do? I mean, I would assume without a doubt, but what do you think?
So I think it's a very interesting question, and I don't know much about specific studies in what is best for memory retention. In my perception, obviously would be better. But especially for long-term effects, proper sleep is very important. But there are immediate effects of improper sleep that you would always feel next day.
Sure.
When the brain is just not optimally functioning. For short-term memory retention, it could work cramming in the last night, because next day you may still remember but forget it the day after. So it's just not best for the long-term memory retention.
Mm-hmm.
But proper sleep is huge, both in physical performance, in our eating habits, but also in stress responses. And that comes into how we treat ourselves, how we treat others. You know, there's just so many facets of how it can play out.
That leads me to another question.
Mm-hmm.
Do you notice how there are some people that always say they're tired, no matter what happens? I think there are some people that have a fatigue issue.
Mm-hmm.
And it could be diet, lack of exercise, lack of actual sleep. But I think there are some people mentally that just have this "I'm tired" attitude. They just are always tired. And if they kind of do it maybe for like a pity thing, like, feel bad for me, I'm so productive and I'm so busy all the time, I'm so tired. But I feel like if you constantly say that, you're going to convince yourself that you're always tired. Does that make sense? On a neurological level.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. But let me just tap into this a little further. So I see it all from both perspectives from the level of mental, intellectual feeding that like projects into the capabilities of the body and the mind, and the physiological perspective. So there's this connection, which is still, I'm not even going to say that I'm speaking from a scientific perspective, because everything that we experience in the daily basis.
You always sound like, it always kind of sounds like a scientific.
Yes, also because I have an accent.
No.
Sounds smarter.
Well, maybe, but I think you speak in a way that's very scientific. I feel like it could be a very simple thing, like a water bottle, and you'll just make it sound like science.
It is science.
You're a nerd at heart.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Everywhere. The heart and the brain.
Mm-hmm.
So there is the interplay. So everything we experience from the moment we wake up is our conscious experience, but also there is the unconscious part of the experience, which is not well defined in science. Mm-hmm. And consciousness has been a taboo for studying from a scientific perspective for decades, and it was always a realm of spirituality or religion or philosophy. So only recently, comparably recently, the scientists have been trying to embody the consciousness into the fields of biology, into the fields of physics and quantum physics and neuroscience. Mm-hmm. But it's still been a very slow process. But at least now, it used to be that like professors at the universities and institutions would advise the younger faculty or younger scientists to not talk about this subject until maybe they get a tenure. So now it's not as bad as it used to be. You could still talk about the subjects. They really
wouldn't talk about these subjects until they had tenure?
Yes, because it was a taboo. It's like, what is consciousness? And it's this, just nobody knew how to integrate it into all of this physical reductionist models of our biology. Mm-hmm. And now the approach is still, now there is a big movement into understanding consciousness because of the creation of the artificial intelligence and trying to make conscious machines, mm-hmm. or at least to make them somewhat human-like. But also, there is still the approach of scientific reductionism of trying to understand consciousness on the level of neurons and connections between the neurons and the molecular releases of the neurotransmitters and specific synapses of the brain, and how this somehow creates this experience, right? It is definitely a complex, fundamental question. Mm. But to answer your question about like different states of tiredness and lack of energy. They're both physicality, both our physical existence and our mental existence, they're constantly interacting. So if you are exhausted from the lack of sleep, then you will have more like reactive oxygen species in the brain. Your reality would be processed differently. Also, from the energetic perspective, there will be more stress, it's just stress molecules in the body, basically. There would also potentially, like there are studies showing that the night, if you didn't have a good sleep at night, or if you had to stay up till late, then evolutionarily it is it is the perception of having to hunt for food. Like it used to be that people wouldn't sleep because they had to hunt for food. Like they were hungry, so that's the only reason why you would be at night and hungry at night. So then people often overeat the next day because of the accumulation of that stress and that feeling that now they have to eat, they have to hunt for food. So that already messes up the energy systems in the body. And so from the perspective of energy and life, all life is a form of utilization of energy that goes against disorder into a self-organizing, ordered system, basically. So moving away from entropy into using the energy in order to self-organize. So everything in life is about using energy and smart using of energy. So there is another very nice point that I'd like to make, that everything in life tries to be very efficient. Evolution itself is very efficient. So it would try to achieve any process would try to be achieved with the minimal amount of effort necessary in order to come to a specific outcome. What I see a lot in our nowadays human existence and our models of human behavior is that we tend to have almost like the evolution, our physiological, genetic, biological evolutionary state is not keeping up with the level of development of technology and change of lifestyle that we have. Does it make sense? Like we are bombarded with amounts of information on everyday basis that probably humans 100 years ago didn't experience in a lifetime of how much they have to process in a day.
Right. But I think that's why it's such a pro and con, though. Because back in the day, it was more simplistic, where you focus on 3 tasks a day. You know, you pick corn, you mow the lawn, you change the diaper. Well, if there weren't even diapers back then, but whatever form of diapers they had, there was something, I'm sure. There were much fewer things to do because you couldn't accomplish as much back then. So, in a sense, our brains. This is why we have such bad ADD now. So many people have such a hard time focusing on so many things. And I think we're kind of forced to. So some people can, but I think for many people we just end up doing 20 things very poorly in attempting to get them all done at the same time.
That's very much. But if you also think about it, everything requires energy. And the most efficient could be, again, like looking at nature, is doing less in order to achieve something. But then we could look into evolution of the brain too, and that constant, first of all, the amounts of stress, and then constant bombardment by a lot of tasks and multitasking, that our brain still is, like evolution does not move so fast to catch up with technological progress. So we still, even with development of, let's say, microchips, and I would say the holographic reality, the virtual reality systems, like if you look at the studies, brain cannot keep up. Like it messes with the brain in a way that when you wear in, let's say, the virtual reality and its gadgets and
That messes with the brain?
Oh, absolutely. First, like it will mess because there are signals. We obviously evolved to live in this reality.
I gotta tell this to one of my friends. I don't have any of these things. I couldn't. These things do not, like VR. I don't know. It doesn't entice. I don't care about video games or any of those things anymore. When I was younger, I cared. But I have a friend that's crazy about this whole VR stuff. He bought this whole crazy gizmo that was worth like who knows how much, a couple of $1,000s. So go on, because I'm very curious, because hopefully he'll be listening to this. So it negatively affects the brain?
Somewhat, yes. And I think it is quite enticing. I mean, of course, you can experience a different reality. I think it could be quite helpful too, especially with things like
a virtual reality, if you will.
Yes, it could be very helpful to even, I could imagine, with some syndromes like phantom limb syndrome.
Sorry?
Like people who have amputated limbs, but they still have phantom pain, which is like a pain in a non-existent limb. Yes. So there are studies that how it could be cured with a mirror effect, like having a mirror to show as if you're moving the limb that is still there, and having to like basically evaluate the reality that would help to integrate those signals in the brain, in the cortex, in order to lose that sensation of pain in non-existent limb. But in any case, it's a diverting conversation. One of the shortcomings is that the virtual reality is still, I mean, it could be potentially as real as this reality, but at this time it is not. So then there is the incongruence of the incorporation of the signals that come from, let's say, visual processing. And visual processing is one of the most, is probably the most of the basal system that consciousness, or like the brain relies onto compared to other systems, sensory systems. So if the visual signal, so the brain would prefer visual, to rely on visual signal. That's what I'm trying to say. If the motor orientation, like the balancing systems, are given other signals than what you're perceiving with your visual reality. Let's say in the virtual reality, if you're falling down, but you're actually standing on the ground in the physical reality, then there is a incongruence between signals that come from the visual
I totally understand.
Senses.
It's incongruent because in the virtual world you're falling, in the real world you're not. You're staying there.
So then
the brain's kind of like what's going on.
Exactly. It's almost like it definitely gives headaches. But long term, I don't know. I haven't looked so much into the studies, but I can imagine that there are just some shortcomings to that.
It's completely it's confusing the brain because the brain maybe doesn't know what's actually going on.
Absolutely. Absolutely. But then, so going back to that notion of people when they start telling themselves stories like, if I'm constantly tired, and how does it affect the physical experience or the actual conscious experience?
Oh, I can tell you. Sorry, I'm interrupting. I can tell you like point blank. Sometimes that I've gone like several days straight without sleep. Worst, horrible experience. You feel like an absolute zombie. You're just like grabbing onto the last bits of energy you have to like actually, it's horrible.
Yes, absolutely. But also convincing yourself just mentally that you're tired. If you're completely normal and you keep up with your schedule, but you have that mindset of not having enough energy. So I think part of it could be coming, like I was saying, from just too much information that is feeding into the brain, and often from unconsciously processed sources of information. So then what is also being bombarded in that case is what is called the default brain network, which is, I don't know if you ever heard about it, but it's, and by far I'm not an expert on it. It's more of the cognitive neuroscience field, and it's called functional connectivity studies, which are usually derived from the magnetic resonance imaging or the observation of the blood flow in the brain and correlation of that blood flow with perceived activity of the brain, different brain regions based on tasks. So default mode brain network is the way that brain functions, how the blood flows to the brain on average when it doesn't do much, like rest. It's called resting state. It doesn't do much. It's not perhaps doing any specific tasks. And and how I would describe it perhaps is, again, it's a network in the sense that like is the pattern of the brain, how different regions are used to communicating with one another. And so in that sense, almost 40% of the blood flow goes into that default mode brain network, which is also perceived as the center, no, not a center, or sort of like the creator of the ego construct or the perception of the self and preoccupation with the self in the brain, which I think it's also quite exhausting. That's just my personal statement. I think it's quite exhausting to be obsessed with those ideas of the self, and the more you think about it, the more you are engaged into that default mode brain network and thinking about the self, which is like usually it's thinking about yesterday or thinking about tomorrow, thinking
overthinking. Are you kind of talking about that?
You could call it that.
So what do you mean exactly by thinking of the self?
Well, it's usually preoccupation by so like the dangers, constantly thinking about things that happened in the past and how to avoid the bad things that happened in the past in the future, and how to avoid or how to seek out the pleasure in the future that would be beneficial to the self and self-survival. And preoccupation with the self itself. I'm not making
I do
much
think
sense.
I hear what you're saying. I actually think I'm following you, but I'm just trying to make sure I understand you. I think some people are going to be confused by what you said, though.
So, again, default mode brain network is so like the combination of the activity of the brain or the pattern of the activity of the brain that is at resting state, at normal state of our daily function, is preoccupied with the perception of the self, which is the daily tasks of what needs to be done in order to basically to survive, for ego to survive, for self to survive. It is preoccupied with its own personality, with the questions of the past that could be useful for the future, of like how to, in a sense, how to use experiences of the past in order to seek enjoyment and avoid pain in the future as well. So that's like the kind of processing that is happening, and it's a pattern of activity, and it interestingly takes up to 40%. Is like the combination of the small regions takes up to 40% of the whole energy of the brain that feeds into that network, which means that if the person is overthinking and constantly preoccupied or by those matters of being worrying about the future because of the experiences of the past and not being in the present moment, then the more energy goes into it, then it's going to be experienced as like a mental fatigue, but it's actually also an energy fatigue as well. And interestingly, those default mode brain networks are altered in the states of, let's say, deep meditation. So we know that those ego centers of the brain, or at least the way we see it right now, are being subsided, as well as it happens during psychedelic experiences such as psilocybin or magic mushrooms experiences, when it specifically affects that brain connectivity and specifically affects the alteration of the default mode brain network, which is also combined and correlated with those experiences of dissolution of the ego and experiences of oneness, experiences of being fully present and integrated in the present moment.
Look, I have a question. Would you not say in a sense that this is a virtual reality? Meaning somebody that's done magic mushrooms, I don't know what I'm calling it, magic shrooms. Someone that's done shrooms on several occasions will be like, not at all. It's not like you're wearing some VR machine. It's part of you. Your brain is expanding, but that isn't your everyday reality. Meaning it might be what's actually happening, but you aren't conscious of it when you aren't on it. You get what I'm saying? Meaning right now I'm not on shrooms. I am not going to feel I'm not going to feel what I feel if I'm on it. You get what I'm saying? So is that a virtual reality, or is that just actual reality? But since I don't experience it in my daily life, it seems virtual. This is something that I feel like tons of people ask, but here now we wait for your answer.
I can see that. I can see that as a question that doesn't have an answer, because it obviously would be like, what is the truth? Is this reality real? I don't think anybody really has, deep. And nobody has an answer to this question. Mm-hmm. But it is absolutely intriguing to know that the experiences of those reports of being on magic mushrooms, it's a feeling that reality is more real than this reality. But also, I think what matters, or how we could approach understanding this, is it really is altered states of consciousness overall. And there are so many different expressions of altered states of consciousness, of course, from the loss of consciousness, like in a coma, to vegetative states, locked-in syndrome, when the person is conscious but not able to move the body, or unable to give any signals, to psychedelic experiences and experiences such as psilocybin-triggered or LSD-triggered experiences, to also things like near-death experiences, which is also like maybe could be integrated under umbrella of altered states of consciousness.
They always talk about the life flashing before your eyes. There's a lot in Judaism specifically. I can't speak for other religions, but there's always this concept of right before they died, they were on their deathbed, and they saw life flash before their eyes, and they saw, everything that happened in their life just flash at once.
Right.
And then I've heard this outside of Judaism. I've heard people make this claim in general, where and they see the angel of death, or they see some scary being or deity or some of sorts.
Well, I would definitely leave this to a different conversation, but I would invite people to look up some signs of even like YouTube videos of research on near-death experiences. I think it's from Pennsylvania Institute, and I don't remember exactly the name, but there are scientific approaches of studying those near-death experiences and those reports. And it is quite interesting. But going back to experiencing reality on mushrooms versus on a daily basis, like there are other ways to alter reality. So what I'm truly trying to say is there's this extreme, and this extreme of the psychedelic reality versus the extreme of, like just a very average normal reality. But then there's the experience in between. There is a range, and there's this spectrum. So from that extreme can also be different based on the dosage. There's a dose effect. There's an effect of environment. There's effect of physiologically where the person starts from taking those mushrooms, whether it's a fasted state, a tired state, whether there's an intention or not. Then there is this reality. This reality is also, I think perhaps most people experiences it, the reality overall is somewhat similar from day-to-day basis, and mostly I think it comes from the models of the brain function. Like brain is a very intelligently designed, I wouldn't say brain, I would say nervous system, and just a whole organism is by itself is intelligently designed system. So from that perspective, brain likes to create shortcuts, and most of the shortcuts come from past experiences, of course. So there is enough significant amount of experience for the brain to create a shortcut to experience it in a certain way.
This makes me think of, when you say shortcut, do you mean that you're so used to a certain thing that it becomes second nature? Is that anything, or what are you talking about?
Yes, of course. It's almost like first it takes a struggle in order to acquire a skill.
Okay, so that's exactly. So we have a thing called the 4 levels in real estate. Well, it's not real estate specifically, but this is what we've learned, and I've heard this before, but it's been very applicable now in what I do. Is the notion of unconscious incompetence, then you have unconscious competence, then you have conscious incompetence, unconscious competence, and I think conscious competence. I think I said this properly, but essentially you go through these 4 stages where initially you don't know what you don't know, then you don't know what you do know,
what you're talking about.
then you know what then you know what you know, meaning like you know what you're doing, but you still have to kind of work at it. And then there's a stage where you know exactly what's going on. You don't even have to really put effort into it. It's just the subconscious movement. And you can get to that point in most aspects of your life. Specifically, driving really gives me that feeling, where in the beginning you're really just you're paying attention to every little detail. And then once you're on the highway, after even a few months of driving, especially after a few years, you'll find yourself forgetting that you're even driving. You'll kind of drift off for a moment. You get what I'm saying?
Absolutely.
And your brain and you're fully aware. How does that work? So that you're a perfect person to ask. How does your brain still focus? Because part of your brain is completely focused on the road. You're still, the wheel is still turning, slightly. You're driving perfectly fine, but you'll drift off and start thinking about like strawberries, and then you'll zone back in and be like, oh wow, I'm on the highway. How does that happen?
Exactly. Well, again, it's very intricate, but like I said, brain is extremely intelligent. Nervous system is very intelligently designed. So at first, these are motor skills, which I think are a little more easier to comprehend or easier understood.
The motor skills in Russia, they're not a lot. They have a tough time. The drinking in Russia, so the motor skills aren't always on point.
Right. Well, so the part of the brain that is largely responsible for learning motor movements or for coordinated and for coordination and balance is called cerebellum, which is one of the most primary parts in the back of the brain, and it's separate from cortex and from other systems. So that part of the brain is responsible for. It's very intricately designed. It's so complex. I don't think I could possibly explain it in an intelligible way, but it's just designed through a mastery of feedback loops, constantly sending out the signals, and those signals are sent out through neurons and combination of networks from an information that is being put in, or the input, processing and output. So constantly receiving the information from the sensory nerves, and both from vision, from the proprioception, for proprioceptive systems, sensing the environment, and then going through the process of feedback or inhibition of the unnecessary movement. So then once the process becomes automatic, the conscious part of it, or paying attention to how it's done, is being removed. So now you really don't need to, it becomes a second nature, because it becomes unconscious process.
And it's fascinating how that works. And it's also fascinating that it can be something that's very hard to do. Very hard to do. It can be taking a trick bike and going over on this, what do they call them? People who do these tricks are going to be like, hey, yeah, you don't know what it's called? What are those things called again? Oh, my God. Anyway, you know what I'm talking about.
Yes.
I used to know, but right away, but I forgot. use something or whatever. So they go on, they do all these tricks and these flips and these. I mean, if they land wrong, they can break like all their bones, like half the bones in their body, or they can be seriously injured. Second nature. They've been practicing this for years. They've landed on their back, on their legs, broken bones. But after a certain period of time, they just go. They get on the bike and they do it. For your average person, they look at that and they're like, "Holy shit! I'm not trying that." They can't even try to, or surfing, or anything, going to battle, going to war as a soldier. For some people, it's second nature.
Very much.
So and
it is for us. I mean, walking becomes our second nature, like eating, brushing hair, all of that. But what I find really interesting is if you try to think about it or like explain it to somebody, when you're trying to teach somebody of like what exactly you're doing, and you go back to trying to replicate it with a conscious engagement, often happens is like you don't know what you're doing and you forget. If you try to drive and to explain what you're doing by language and stopping by and consciously saying, well, I do this first, or like, then often you would find yourself like, I don't really know what I'm doing. It's almost like you forgot how to drive immediately, because it's actually the unconscious process now that is so natural, and the consciousness actually doesn't know what is even going on.
Well, I could explain it personally, but I mean, we're talking about driving specifically, but I'm sure there are things, like I can explain how to drive to someone.
Okay, but
let's just... Sorry, Did I kill your point? I'm just saying. You gave me an example.
Give another example. So if you ask someone to smile, but they're not really feeling cheerful, then the smile would be, I think you could obviously tell, like it would be different, or you wouldn't be smiling with your eyes. It would look fake, because there are different parts of the brain that are responsible for like conscious smiling or like trying to fake it versus the actual natural smile.
Are those real? Those?
Can you tell?
I think so. I think it seems real to me. I hope so.
So going back to the conversation of what is real, between the range of between the psychedelic experiences and other states of altered states of consciousness, which I was about to tap into to say they could be states of prolonged fasting, when your mind is super clear and relieved from all this amounts of energy that go into digestion. I don't know if you experienced that. I've practiced quite a bit with fasting myself, and I love it as a tool for altering brain performance and
we do it in Judaism.
Performance.
We have
very
a few
good.
Days.
Yes, that's
we
right.
just had one that passed recently, Yom Kippur.
Yes, that's right.
So it's like a 25-hour fast. There's a few of them throughout the year.
So another one is states of flow, such as induced by extreme sports, or they could be really induced by other experiences, even walking or listening to music. It's spontaneous states of when you also, in a way, like your ego dissolves, you're being fully in the moment. And those are very similar to psychedelic experiences as well. Like being fully in the moment, to experiences of meditation and meditators. Like it's going away from this default mode brain network and being preoccupied so much with the self and being preoccupied so much with the past and the future, versus being in the moment and fully experiencing reality. The point that I'm trying to make is that you could consciously alter, and like what is really consciousness? One of the definitions could be the attention, and where attention flows, energy goes, and you could actually facilitate the states of mind and the states of body that underline those states of mind by conscious improvement and diverting of your attention to specific thoughts, because thought creates a pattern of feeling creates biochemistry of emotion. It could be stress hormones, it could be other types of hormones, but I think we often live in the reality that is underlined by our baseline biochemical state, and it's a state of neurotransmitters and the receptors for those neurotransmitters. I know I'm talking gibberish to some people, but let's say the why psilocybin has such an effect on the brain. It's very intricate that something in nature exists that has such a profound effect on perception of reality when ingested by humans. and not only by humans. And
do you mean animals?
Animals too, yes.
Well, I mean, obviously.
There are definitely studies of.
What is it?
I remember. I think there was the drosophilone LSD study. You should look into that.
Yeah, but why would they even test a fruit fly?
I don't know.
Like, what's it gonna do? Fly around a little? I mean, like, experiment on an animal that actually has more emotion, not like a little insect,
right,
but an animal that'll actually, like a cat or a dog. Or, I mean, I feel bad. That's also what, like with a fly, genuinely, I don't feel bad testing on flies. But when it comes to those animals, like, I don't want them to feel any kind of pain. So,
absolutely. But perhaps they experience the sense of oneness and happiness
I mean,
under those experiences.
Dogs are already on shrooms all the time anyway.
So, I mean,
they're always so happy and beautiful.
So,
of those.
Interestingly, is this the serotonin 2A receptors that are largely expressed in the neocortex, and specifically in the very outer layers of neocortex, that are being that are to which the psilocybin molecules bind to, and basically they zap those areas of the brain. And speaking from the perspective of the evolution, the neocortex is the latest adaptation. Not only that cortex was evolving throughout in mammals, in the primates, but then the grooves of the cortex is what really the enfoldings of the cortical brain is what differs us largely from other animals. So imagine that part is zapped, and those are naturally existing receptors in the brain. So they could also be, I mean, even from the studies of the neuroimaging, from the neuroimaging perspective, nothing large is so comparable to when on large doses on psilocybin, but meditation states could be similar. Like, you can induce these states by yourself. You have the receptors for it. You have the molecules that you are able, by diverting the attention, and again by diverting the attention, let's say from the self, from the thought obsessed by self, the thought obsessed with the past, the thought obsessed with the future. So the default mode brain network, if you consciously divert that attention, and I call it mind hacking and biohacking, but you could know your triggers or know certain disciplines, routines that you do. To me, it could be like doing acro yoga or dancing, or it could actually be meditation, and specifically diverting from first, like, silencing the mind, completely shutting down any thoughts that come about the past or the future or the self. And then you can induce those states. You can induce them. But then the more you change your biochemistry, you adapt to, like, the brain is extremely adaptive system, and the human body as well, like genetics, is very adaptive. There will be changes in gene expression happening immediately, and there could also be patterns of gene expression that are lasting, going back to epigenetics question and epigenetic marks that will happen with practice. So in order to, it comes back to the question of, like, how can I experience that on a daily basis? Is that real? Well, you could cultivate those feelings and states that are not maybe truly, could not be like high doses of psilocybin, but they could be very similar in a way that your reality can be completely different and much more magical in that sense. Just by you diverting your conscious attention, you also change your biochemistry, the amount of receptors for those neurotransmitters and the activity of the brain network, as well as the pattern of gene expression, just by changing your thinking.
How would you say, because I think this is very relatable to the male and female gender.
Mm-hmm.
Now, if we were to talk about relationships, how do you think this ties in, say, if we're talking about neurotransmitters in in reference to our negative experiences. Positive experience too, but let's say we have a traumatic experience with abusive parents or an abusive spouse. How do we train our minds to then, in future relationships, not carry that over?
Right.
And that's very heavy conversation. It can be. I'm curious to hear about this, but any kind of negative trait where maybe somebody was in a relationship that somebody wasn't faithful to them, and then going forward they have these trust issues. So they may spill over into that new relationship, and the relationship may suffer because of the bad experiences that person had. So what are ways that we can train our mind to, and it's maybe impossible to fully train our mind to ignore this because it happened, but how can we, in the general sense, train our brains to let go of, or at least control, these experiences, so we now have more of a positive experience with our current or future partner or spouse?
Right. That is a great question. I think it's so important in any relationships.
Thank you, ma'am.
Not
Appreciate
only relationships of genders, friendships, and there is huge potential, I think, in the power of knowledge and the power of knowledgeable, intelligible practices in order to truly relieve that part of the part of that suffering human existence that perpetuates in the patterns of relationships. So there is a part of the brain evolutionarily that is the reptilian brain, right? Our reptilians don't care about their offspring, they don't care about their partners. They definitely just don't give a damn. And then there's the limbic system, which is very specific to, in that sense, to mammals, and it's the emotional brain, and all of us have it. The emotional brain, which is largely learning by avoiding pain and seeking pleasure, seeking anything that's going to benefit life and procreation, and avoiding anything that can damage the organism and kill it or cause pain. So that system, when we are still developing as children in the childhood, that is so largely important because the neocortex, the cortical regions, and the whole, what we call the connections or the myelination. The myelin is the white matter, the wrapping around the nerves, the axons of the nerves that protects and helps with the signaling, helps with the communication in the brain. It keeps happening throughout teenage years up until I think almost like 25 years of age, and the myelination goes from the back of the brain to the prefrontal cortex. So the emotional brain is at the very kind of center, right on top of the brainstem, and then it is developing by learning these first experiences of pleasure and pain. So it is very unconscious. Those are very fast reactions that as brain evolves and the myelination occurs in the more evolved parts of the brain, the inhibitory or the more of the higher processing occurs. And also that's those parts of the brain that I was telling you about, that are zapped during psychedelic experiences. Those are the invigorated parts of the brain that would also be responsible for the processing of the emotion, the reaction to that emotion, the meaning and the interpretation of that emotion. But before that happens, the experiences are so imprinted in early childhood because children in that sense are unable to process and to stand outside of themselves. Plus children don't even have, let's say, ego develops as a construct after maybe 3 years of age, so they don't know what is I. Right, and then I begins, and you are that self, and then you wonder what that self is, and the perception of the self, and how to also preserve it, how to protect that self, and it is there are modes of behavior, and I think it goes way into psychology, and again, I wouldn't claim to be an expert on it, but the way I see it is the importance of practices to be able to, which are in therapy are called like inner child practice. The inner child therapy is by altering, going back into experiences, or not necessarily even going back into experiences, but tapping into those responses and reactions of pain versus pleasure or fear, those very primal emotions of fear, emotions of anger, it's preoccupation with safety, from the more evolved place and more evolved place, what we would call, I guess, top-down approach from a more evolved regions of the brain and our consciousness. But I think amazing therapy that is being used, hypnosis is extremely powerful, and it taps into this idea of remodeling past experiences. You could go back into the memory in a way you can change the reaction within your memory, the reaction to the trigger that caused it, and then it would not cause that same reaction. It would not be that unconscious trigger when a similar situation arises, when you're talking about perpetuating the past maybe experiences of lack of trust into the future relationships. In a way, like you could work with past incident in order to transform the emotional reaction of the past by altered states of consciousness. That's why psychedelics are also so powerful on the studies of patients with PTSD who've been in the war. Psychedelics are much more potent than any other therapist, and they have much more lasting effects just from one session.
But what if it brings a negative? Like, who's to say that the mushrooms aren't going to bring on more of a negative feeling? Let's say you watched your friend, I'm just being very direct, what if you watched your friend die in front of you? You take mushrooms to try to forget about that experience, and what if it intensifies? Who's to say that it...
So I think a combination of the therapy with like guided therapy with...
guided mushroom therapy, if you will.
Yes.
Do you teach a mushroom guided therapy class?
No, I don't. I should.
You should.
But there were also studies... There were also studies of using MDMA with the PTSD psychotherapy, which is also a much more enhanced, much more powerful experience of a relief from that emotional attachment. So it's always about the direction of that experience, and often it's the attention, because psychedelic experiences, they take you into that place of very focused attention on whatever it is that consciousness is being drawn to in the moment. So you could divert that attention. So it's good to have some sort of guidance. But ultimately, consciousness may itself resolve it on its own. I think what matters most in this case is in the idea of how to be the best to have optimal relationships by not dragging the traumas of the inner child into relationships. First is the awareness, is knowing that there is this part that is very primitive and that is always like scared and attached, and the awareness itself is already a big step forward. But then knowing that there are practices that I think should be practiced as mental hygiene on everyday basis, and people
mental
should
hygiene,
know about
that's a very
them.
interesting word.
There should be, yes, they should be taught in schools. And now I think there's some change in the ways that meditation is being taught in some schools. So meditation should be really incorporated into everyday life, just like you take a shower. If you feel nasty in the mornings or in the evenings after a long day of sweaty Miami weather, you take a shower. The same way with the brain and the mental, with your consciousness, it's so important to take the showers, and we're so not used to that.
A mental shower.
We're so not used to that. We're not taught in our society to do that, and it really should be one of the fundamental practices, as well as some of the practices of self-work of, like I said, hypnosis is a very powerful practice, so it's sort of like this guided experiences when it's more not just silencing the mind, not just coming to inner quietness, but also to actually redirecting and diverting those experiences from the emotionality of responses to a more conscious, more evolved responses and integration. And like I said, I think psychedelics are great for that as well. As well as I think it's very intricate to understand, just quickly going to say brain has, or neuroscience may give a lot of answers to human relationships, in the sense that I think people should be aware that there is a whole realm of brain disorders, really, and some of them are, the fundamental triggers are stress. It's not even disorder, but in our society, I think it could be called a disorder. Stress is the worst, the strongest factor that affects human relationships. People under stress they go back to the limbic system, to that primitive mind, to the primitive brain, and they're just not able to have those inhibitory higher processing functions, and they go into the stress mode, and it's such a big question. It deserves like a whole different conversation, but people under stress are not their higher version of themselves.
Yes. Oh, this is such a conversation for another episode.
And it's so important to have those practices to deal with stress, and to be aware how to engage in relationships, and to first of all, to perceive that you're under stress, and to understand how not to harm the relationships because of being in that limbic mode, being in that stress survival mode. And it's nowadays we also being stressed by things that we're not even meant to be stressed about. Like I said, the overwhelm of information, the overwhelm of multitasking, the overwhelm of stimuli, even by checking Facebook and Instagram, which gives way too much. It overdrives the limbic system, actually, also because it's so dopamine driven. It's so driven on that emotional motivation responses from perceptual stimuli, and having a little zap of dopamine spike. And again, it's a whole other different conversation. But the neuroscience can give answers to human relationships also from the standpoint of some brain disorders, not only the hijacked state of the brain, but also some disorders that might not be very visible. They're not visible to us, to a human eye, such as mild traumatic brain injuries, which there's a whole amount of studies on that, as well as how it affects, it could affect, again, emotional processing. It may affect the just the attention span of humans, like different mild, even when you're just in the car and you suddenly stop. Like brain is such a soft tissue, so it bumps against the skull. And depending on where the site of injury, that micro injury is, there could be very specific areas that are responsible for very specific tasks, and that would play out in relationships. So there is this whole other realm, and then there is the realm of our evolutionary adaptation to seeing life differently from the perspective, also from the two different modes of the, like I would call it, the right brain and the left brain, which is largely seen in the studies of the split brain patients, when back in 60s they used to do the procedure of separating the two brain hemispheres by cutting the corpus callosum that would connect the two hemispheres, and they could see how the scientists could see on the patients that even though patients seem to preserve their one personality, their one idea of the being that same self, they still had very different responses to certain tasks. And like if they were shown a word to the right hemisphere with the left eye, or to the stimulus to the left eye, and they were not able to perceive it consciously because the language centers that are situated in the left side of the brain were not aware of the word, because the right hemisphere basically were not able to communicate it to the language centers. But if the patients were asked to draw that word, they would be able to draw it, like to actually have to draw an image of it. So they were like had the knowledge of it, but did not have the perception. when they were asked, they could also be given an order that would only arrive through the left eye. So then it would go into right hemisphere, and they would start implementing that order, such as walking out of the room. Like they were asked to walk out of the room. And the patient would, when asked, why are they walking out of the room, they would come up with an explanation, because left brain has to come up with rationalization, and it's like kind of like very particular function of the left hemisphere is more of the rationalizing and seeing things in parts rather than the more generalized, the big vision type of the right hemisphere perception, and more emotionally processed perception from the right hemisphere. But this is when the phenomenon of what we would call now left brain interpreter came into place, which is that rationalization part of the brain that I think all of us have, but we're not aware of. And we're also so very much driven to be more logically thinking, to use our language skills much more than more of intuitive and imaginary perception of the reality and interpretation of the reality just by our culture, or at least in the West culture opposed to the East culture. And the left brain interpreter, I believe, is one of those very damaging factors in human relationships, because it is very much preoccupied with having consistent narratives that help the ego, the sense of self, the sense of personality, to sustain itself. So they could have patterns that come from that very primitive part of the mind, very primitive part of the brain, limbic system, you know, based on their fears, based on again some of those primitive drives, but they would explain it. Let's say somebody has an addiction, which is also part of the limbic system being hijacked. It could be an alcohol addiction, it could be like porn addiction, but let's say it's a problem. Usually addiction is a problem for a relationship. And the left brain interpreter would always come up with a story that just helps the ego feel better about itself, and to, let's say, to not incorporate that idea of how to evolve in a relationship, or how to be a better person in a relationship, versus to keep up with that story. So I think it's this other big area in which is important for humans to look into, is this understanding of our brain function from the perspective of being optimally supported, being optimally physically supported, having those practices for mental cleansing, and having practices for supporting physical body, but also understanding how mind, we're so tricked in our perceptions, and it's a beautiful area, a necessary area to explore in ourselves in order to become like this well-rounded human with a much more richer experience of reality and understanding of compassion and relation to each other.
Sure. I think that was beautifully said. I really liked what you said about taking a mental shower. You know, you mentioned taking a physical one, obviously, when needed, and then, you know, mentioned the correlation to your mental health. And I think everything you're saying is, you know, very deep and very scientific, but I think it really gives an understanding as to why we do what we do and how we can better ourselves, especially in relationships. So, Elena, it's been a wonderful episode. Thoroughly enjoyed it. Learned a ton. Hope everyone did as well. Guys, a lot of us don't know enough about science. Try to take the time to actually listen to what she has to say. And, okay, even if you don't know some of the scientific terms, you might miss a few sentences. Try to listen to the gist of the conversation. Everything we do kind of comes down, everything we do is connected to science. Everything in this world has a connection. And if we start to understand that, we can better understand ourselves, you know? So without further ado, or not without further ado, but again, thank you so much. Hope to have you on for another episode, because I know there's a lot more we can talk about. Ladies and gentlemen, this has been another episode of Soothing Semantics. Until next time.